and for his briefing, and I now shall deliver a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Russian Federation. Distinguished colleagues, I wish to thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Undersecretary General Martin Griffiths for their assessment of the humanitarian aspects of sanctions, which largely are in alignment with our approaches. Security Council sanctions are an important instrument for the implementation of the functions vested in the Security Council in the maintenance of international peace and security. Such sanctions are one of the strongest responses to the threats to peace, and being such, they should be applied in an exceedingly cautious way, should be irreproachably justified and nuanced. Leveraging sanctions as a punitive weapon is not acceptable. International sanctions need to reflect the situation on the ground, and such sanctions should serve to further a political process, and sanctions regimes should be subject to regular review, and they should be modified, and this includes the full lifting of sanctions where applicable. We emphatically call for the targeted and flexible nature of UN Security Council restrictions to become standard practice. There is a need to closely and attentively heed the views of the authorities of the sanctioned states, and a need to more realistically formulate so-called benchmarks to prevent them from morphing into deliberately unattainable objectives. Based on our assessments, many of the current Security Council sanctions regimes fail now to reflect the situation on the ground. They hamper the plans of national governments in the area of state building as well as socioeconomic development. One can refer, as an example, the Central African Republic and Sudan. Also, sanctions, the persistent sanctions against Guinea-Bissau are a complete anachronism. There's collateral damage emanating from sanctions measures, and this should be considered most seriously. This is manifest in the adverse impacts on national economies and people's lives and welfare. This issue was further exacerbated against the backdrop of the raging coronavirus pandemic. Unfortunately, despite the declarations that Security Council restrictive measures should not impact on ordinary people's lives, in practice, international restrictions often result in worsened socioeconomic situations in the sanctioned states. In this connection, there's a need to continue to fine-tune those mechanisms that are set out in Security Council resolutions. I refer to humanitarian exemptions, including in favor of such exemptions that would be leveraged for humanitarian organizations on a standing basis. It would be possible, for example, to consider drafting lists of goods, but not individual appellations, for example, an international codes of commodity classifications, such lists that under no circumstances can be covered by the restrictive lists. Furthermore, we draw inspiration from the experience of the early 2000s when, even before the imposition of sanctions, there were assessments carried out targeting the humanitarian consequences of them. A daunting obstacle for the full-fledged operation of humanitarian exemptions is so-called secondary unilateral restrictions, which are imposed on top of Security Council sanctions. Contracting parties under threat of falling under harsh national and at times extraterritorial restrictions refuse to establish contracts for procurement of humanitarian assistance, which is permitted by the Security Council. Transport operations are experiencing difficulties in provisions of necessary supplies, and there are difficulties with insurance of cargo, and banks refer to the impossibility of carrying out routine monetary transactions. These examples are egregious and clear in the DPRK. The secondary sanctions of major Western countries create a toxic atmosphere around Pyongyang and result in an unwillingness to cooperate with them, even in those areas that do not fall under international restrictions. It is no coincidence that the Russian Federation, alongside the People's Republic of China, has advanced specific initiatives to address this unfortunate trend if the Council were to think of ordinary Koreans and not merely geopolitics, then this proposal warrants support. One cannot fail to mention the situation in Yemen, which is rightly characterized as the world's largest humanitarian disaster. The measures linked to sanctions, in addition to the unwillingness of stakeholders to refuse from embracing military force, this creates obstacles in the provision of food and fuel. Millions of people, as a result, are suffering from malnutrition, and they lack access to drinking water. It is not acceptable for the banking systems of third countries to profit off of the frozen assets of Libya, which should, in fact, be safeguarded for the future generations of this country in the post-crisis eras. It is inhumane for the elderly and for the critically ill who do not pose a threat to security, for them to waste time waiting when they are permitted, when the permission is granted for them to travel abroad. Do such situations really improve the standing of the Security Council? Turning to Afghanistan, the resolution adopted by the Security Council, Resolution 2615, was of key significance in shedding light on the fact that humanitarian assistance is not a violation of the 1988 sanctions regime, and this, we hope, will help to avert a humanitarian disaster in the country. We believe firmly that the Security Council sanctions apparatus requires a strong dose of humanization. In this connection, one would be well advised to consider ways to minimize the expansive interpretation of sanctions provisions, including through terminological fine-tuning. Perhaps a comprehensive impartial assessment could be carried out of the humanitarian consequences of international restrictive measures, and cooperation and staff of a group of experts in the sanctions committees perhaps could be vested with mandates to monitor the impact of sanctions on the humanitarian situation, and the level of expertise in that area could rise. The authority to report to the Council on adverse consequences of sanctions should also be vested in the specific structures under the Secretariat, such as OCHA, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Distinguished colleagues, the Russian Federation is traditionally guided by the understanding that the sole legitimate sanctions are those of the Security Council. In this connection, we're increasingly troubled by the imposition by certain countries and groups of countries of unilateral coercive measures. We view such unilateral coercive measures as an encroachment upon the prerogatives of the Security Council, creating obstacles for upholding peace. The practice of leveraging such restrictions is interpreted by us as an encroachment upon sovereignty of states and an intervention in their domestic affairs. The trend towards increasingly broad use of unilateral sanctions undermines the norms and institutes of international law. What is particularly intolerable are those situations where certain countries demand implementation of their sanctions restrictions, and they then apply restrictions targeting economic operators of third countries who are operating within the framework of their national legislation. Such extraterritorial imposition of sanctions flies in the face of the most basic norms of international law. The examples abound. The sanctions war that was unleashed against Syria has had an exceedingly adverse impact on the internal situation in the country and has spawned an increasing worsening of the socioeconomic situation. Wide-ranging sectoral restrictions target Belarus. They are geared towards undermining its competitive businesses and destabilizing the social and political situation there. A stark example is a discriminatory policy of implementing unilateral coercive measures is embodied in Cuba. Cuba, which has withstood a blockade from its northern neighbor for more than 60 years already. The real economic terror was unleashed a few years ago against Venezuela and its legitimate government, which, for example, due to the measures imposed, is not in a position to make a contribution to the United Nations regular budget and is hence illegally stripped of its voice at the General Assembly. Sanctions pressure has an adverse impact on the socioeconomic situation in Iran as well. The decisions taken by a number of countries to freeze the government accounts of Afghanistan in Western banks in the wake of the Taliban's taking of power is a major obstacle to the normalization of the lives of ordinary Afghans. We believe that attempts by certain international players to leverage the sanctions stick and exert pressure on the leaders of Myanmar and Mali as illegitimate. Extraterritorial unilateral measures wreak devastating damage for developing countries throughout the world and undermine their ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and they also derail their efforts to counter climate change. What is exceedingly inhumane is the imposition of unilateral restrictions given the current epidemiological situation. Our call for the creation of green corridors for the unfettered movement of medical personnel and goods remains in force. There is an increasingly urgent need for multilateral efforts to seek collective approaches to limit unilateral sanctions in order to avoid a complete loss of faith in international institutions, a definitive collapse of the global economy, and long-term worsening of the socioeconomic situations of ordinary citizens. At the very minimum, the social and humanitarian sphere should be exempted from any restrictive barriers. The Russian Federation has for a long time been addressing this specific issue at key international platforms. On the basis of the rejection of the sanctions philosophy, there is a there's a large circle and a group of like-minded followers in the international community embracing this approach. So the Russian Federation traditionally has co-sponsored resolutions tabled at the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council on behalf of the 9 aligned movements about the adverse consequences of unilateral coercive measures on respecting human rights. Similar positions have been advanced by our partners in the Group of Friends for the Protection of the United Nations Charter, whose representatives will have an opportunity to speak today. Distinguished colleagues, today's discussion, even when it was being prepared, created a lively interest among the United Nations membership. We call upon the Secretary General and other senior leaders of the organization to pay close attention to the issues touched upon today and to speak frankly and openly in favor of such a policy in the area of sanctions that would be focused on individuals and upholding their rights. I once again assume my functions as the President of the Security Council.